Here we come.
Here we go. We are live. Welcome to another Monday night. Ready or not.
Ready or not, we're here. Welcome, welcome. I guess we should go
Oh,
live here
yeah.
on Instagram.
Yes. Sorry, sweet Instagram friends. Yeah, y'all got the late stick there. So I will say welcome to you again. It's a crazy day. Not gonna lie. There, I got it. There, I
There we
got them
go.
rolling.
All right. Yeah, I think I got everything rolling. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Monday. Welcome to Healing the Whole Body podcast, where it's just Becky and I having a chat today. We're having a very interesting chat, as I might point out here in a moment. But first, I want to welcome the folks viewing on YouTube. We're also streaming to 3 Facebook pages, 2 Instagram pages, Twitch, and Rumble. And then these will be uploaded to iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. To be determined. But anyway, welcome. Happy Monday and happy birthday.
Thank you. Yes. It is my birthday. I appreciate all the birthday messages and texts and comments and everything that everyone has shared. I truly appreciate you. You guys are the reason why I do what I do. So without you, friends and my family, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. So, welcome and thank you.
Well, I tried to celebrate your birthday, a month ago?
Yeah.
I was off a little.
Yeah.
I had it on the calendar wrong because I'm like, is it your birthday? Of course, I had already sent you your gift. So it was like, and you're like, no, it's next month. And I'm like, oh, well.
That's all right. You wanted to make sure it arrived on time.
That's right. Too funny.
Well, are we ready ready for the conversation tonight? I don't know that I am, but
well,
we'll
we've
be
kind
ready.
of been we talked about this a week ago. It's a vulnerable conversation that Becky is going to have tonight. But it's a real in-depth look at her journey that she's been through. She sent me some pictures and said, what do you think? Should I be vulnerable? And of course, my first instinct was, I said, no, don't show. And it's like, yeah, you need to show what it truly looks like to heal and what the journey is. And I like to hide behind, from here up, right? Not showing from here down. So anyway, but I think it's an important conversation, and I'm so glad that you're willing to do it. So I'm going to let you just start talking.
Yeah. So for those, it is. And with starting our blog and kind of opening up, the day to day, that we've noticed that there's a lot of people that need the support. They need to be able to resonate. And I've always been one that has been pretty much an open book with my story. But there's a little more to the story, right? And I've had a lot of questions as of recently also of the space where, my journey is kind of transitioned, or they'll see pictures on Instagram and they're just not able to fully put the puzzle together. And it's been a while since I've done, an update on this page in regards to myself. So we decided, hey, what better of a night, right? Than my birthday to take the spotlight. One way or another. But when I ended up and started my journey, a lot of people just end up and know from the time, that I essentially was in my 30s and started to have health issues. They've never really seen before that. They've never, kind of heard the challenges or heard the background, if you will. And so when I was in high school, I was active, but I also wasn't eating correctly, right? Typical teenager, I was eating, if I didn't eat school lunch, I would end up and grab a diet Pepsi and whatever I could find in the vending machine. It may have been a candy bar, it may have been, who knows what else, right? But then my metabolism was good. Fast forward a few years, and I started working evenings and night shift. When I graduated high school. So I was low man on totem pole in healthcare, and I started working night shift. And the reason why this is going to come into play is the circadian side of things and my hormones. I honestly feel as though that is when, even though at that point, I hadn't had children yet, um, I do feel that it played a role in my hormones and, kind of some of the other health conditions that I was dealing with. And then I was 21 when I had my first child. And then I had, my son and daughter after that. After my last child, we're going to speed through some of these years. So I gained weight, of course, with the first one, 21 years old, first time mom, 8 for 2. That led, to some gestational diabetes, prediabetes, following that, or postpartum, if you will. And I never really had the depression of postpartum depression, but I just wasn't necessarily my happy going self. And then she was about a year old, and I ended up getting divorced. So, a lot of life stress at this point, playing into things. And so, it all cortisol, when we look at the hormones, it's all playing in there, right? As far as the stubborn weight gain, as far as gaining weight. Then I had my son and my daughter, and it was after my daughter that most people end up and know the story. So I was having some health issues. I did stress tests. I had some cardiac issues. I had, several other, ultimately, I had asthma. I had pre-diabetic. My A1C was like 6.0. Asthma, diabetes, thyroid issues. I had, I knew I was going to forget part of this story. Asthma, cardiac issues. That was the other one. I was seeing a heart doctor for a leaky heart valve. Hormone issues. I ended up having a hysterectomy when I was 29, 30 years old, somewhere in there. And that's kind of what started me on my journey, was that part of it. And that's where people end up and know, because I wanted to take more of a holistic approach. I wanted to take more of a nutrition approach. I had been keto at that point, after my daughter, kind of doing what you did, right? Searching keto, finding different, Weight Watchers. We had a local Weight Watchers in 2015, 2016. I made lifetime member. Woohoo! Got my keychain, got all of that. And then it closed. That's when I found keto, was working with a gal. We did a lot of walking the halls, all of that type of thing. But then I stumbled on carnivore. And of course, I thought, I can end up and do carnivore, right? We always get a beef, we get a pig, we put it in the freezer. And that's when we're going vulnerable here, people. That's when I ended up and I started my journey, and I started taking pictures. Anyone that's ever heard me coach will say, take pictures, take measurements beyond, and really end up and be able to document your journey. So I don't have the front on view, but this is the side view at least, and you can see, that I have a little bit of a belly going on here, but this wasn't my ultimate highest. This was just kind of the beginning of when I was starting, and then this was during carnivore. So I had started, and then you'll hear people say, end up and eat meat, like it's your job, right? Eat meat. And I was eating meat. I was eating 3 steaks a day. For those that don't know the beginning, also, I was working with Sean Baker, and at the time it was Meat RX. I was eating 3 steaks a day, but then I was gaining weight, and my A1C at that point wasn't getting better. So I switched. I ended up and I went high fat, low protein. Looking back at it, I will say low protein. I would always end up at say a moderate amount of protein, but it is low protein. And it worked. There were aspects that it worked for. It did drop the A1C initially when I took, a lot of those things out. It helped with the asthma. I also, when I started, because I wanted to take that holistic approach, I quit taking my medicine. I don't advise that for anyone that is listening. Medical disclaimer. I do not end up and advise that for anyone that, is listening. Make sure you work with your practitioner. But I did just cold turkey a lot of my medicine, and I was
But
on
you were fed up, right? I
I
mean,
was.
you were at kind of a breaking point when you did that, right?
Yeah. I was tired. I was at, they always say we have our rock bottom. I hate taking medicine. I hate taking any form of a pill. And I sure in the hell okay, so we're going to end up in backtrack. With my daughter, I had and this is why I know hormone were at play. So I had hormone issues with her to the point where I had to end up and get injections in order to have a thick enough uterine lining to carry her to term. And anyone that's ever had progesterone injections, that shit's like syrup. Sorry if there's any youth watching. That shit's like syrup. I mean, it hurts, and I was getting them 2 to 3 times a week. That is how low my levels were. And thankfully, I ended up and I worked. Thankfully, but not thankfully, knowing what I know now. Thankfully, I worked at a hospital, so I could have, if we weren't busy, I could go into the ultrasound tech and be like, "Hey, can we do an ultrasound?" And so I did have that advantage, small town hospital, to be able to know and be reassured of what was going on. I did carry her pretty much to term, and the reason why I say that is we did end up taking her a little bit early because I did deliver in a small town hospital, so we had to plan accordingly. I had to make sure, because I wanted an epidural. Third child, I knew what I was expecting. I wanted
Right.
the epidural. But we also had to have all the other staff. So people like respiratory, the delivery team, they weren't all necessarily on staff. They had to be called in. Needless to say, I think I had half of the county in there by the time we were all said and done with all the people, but everyone had to be, in-house. So we did end up and schedule the delivery. I was induced with her, but she was healthy. We carried her to term. And with that being said, again, that's also where the hormone issues started. And then not even 2 years after that is when I had the hysterectomy. So I was done. I had dealt with that. I had all sorts of meds that I was taking, from levothyroxine for Hashimoto issues to SSRIs to pulmonary inhalers. I mean, the list just went on of beta blockers. I was on beta blockers for the cardiac stuff. I was done. And
Didn't they have you wired up at one point?
Yeah, I wore a Holter monitor. I actually had a 7-day Holter monitor while they were trying to figure it out because I was having syncope episodes. Like I would end up and get up out of bed, and next thing I know, I'm laying on the floor because I would pass out. Now this was before, you know, I had started anything, but this was part of the aspect of being done, right? And sorry, I'm turning my ringer off. So I had worked with my doctor there at the small town hospital, and I had told her, I said, if I end up and I do my lab work and I send it to you, will you work with me in getting off of this? I said, because I'm done. I am tired. I can make myself sick. And I was always so nauseous too. Because I could, and I knew it was mentally, but I could make myself sick thinking of taking the medicine. I mean, and that's one of the other reasons why I don't use a lot of supplements besides my electrolytes, because I can just the thought of having to swallow a bunch of pills, I don't want to live that way. I don't want to live on having to take or rely on. And so it started the scramble, and I say scramble because again, I was googling, I was searching. We didn't know much at that point about keto or carnivore. I mean, keto there was more on the internet, but carnivore, what? We're just going to end up and eat steaks, right? And then we ended up forming, you know, at the time, all Sean had was in 2018 was the website Meat Heals. He transitioned into MeatRx in November of 2019. And that's when we started that platform. And then I started transitioning into, you know, different macros, because what was it that would work for me, right? Obviously, when I went and was just eating meat and the A1C would go up, I knew that I couldn't eat just steaks. So I did high fat, low protein, and it started working. I did end up and start to lose weight. I felt pretty good. I felt a lot like the depression improved. The gut issues, that was one of the other things I had was IBS. And so I was always such an advocate for the higher fat. And I did create ultimately the fat fasting, and it worked. There were definitely, I mean, you can end up and see from, you know, the photo that skin started to improve. Just overall, there were things that worked until it, well, here, I have one more. So that was, you can start to see until it didn't. It worked until it didn't. So this is, they're not great photos, but this is, you know, during carnivore, this is when I had a interview with a good friend. Speaking of carnivore, speaking of the higher fat side, because it did bring my A1C down. It stabilized the blood glucose. It, you know, there were a lot of things that ended up and worked, but then it started to stop working. And the weight, well, I did lose weight. So from my ultimate highest to where I was here, I had lost about 50 pounds. Yeah, 50, 60 pounds at this point. Um, ultimately, I'm currently looking for the photo. So this is one that I end up and I use as my beginning photo, because this was almost at my highest. I had hated these family pictures. I was hiding behind these family pictures. I was dealing with a lot of the health issues here. This is when I was had my hysterectomy. So this would have been 2017, 2018, summer of 2018. we had gone to the lake and taken family pictures for my mom. And I hated them because I was in a waist trainer. I was in Spanx. You can see by the bulges that, I'm gunny in or a pig in a gunny sack essentially. Because I had everything compressed. And yeah, it was, so that was one of the highest. But going back to this one, I had been carnivore, and then it wasn't working. I had tried different macros. I had tried the high fat. I had tried the high protein. Um, at this point, I had started also doing some fasting. The thing here also is I was not respecting sleep, because one of the meetings that I also did for MeetRx was an early morning workout. So I was getting up at like 4:30, 5 o'clock, getting on, a Zoom meeting and doing an early morning workout. Would always talk about, my 5 a.m. workout. Yeah, it was crazy.
Why did that backfire, Becky? For those that don't know.
Because a lot of hormones are circadian hormones. So things like leptin that ends up and tells our body we have energy has to be able to dock in the evening time and get proper sleep. Well, if I wasn't going to sleep until late and then I'm getting up early and, just not getting that proper sleep, and then let alone the fact of getting up at 5 a.m. and going to what I call my dungeon, right? And having enough lights on. I wasn't doing red light workout or anything along those, but I was blasting myself with this bright light first thing in the morning, which then ends up and tells my body that it needs to make cortisol. Plus, I was doing it as a fasted workout. So I did have energy other than, my body energy, right? But it was still a cortisol response. And so my body perceived that as stress, and it no longer felt safe. It was to the point where it's like, we're going to end up and hang on because this gal, she's doing something crazy, and we need to be able to survive through this. And yeah, it was ultimately, we did that, or well, I did the early morning workout for probably a good 6 months before we took that meeting off of the calendar. um and then I'm like, yeah, I can't do this. This is not something that I can be consistent with. And I stopped working out at that point. Which
I remember a number of years ago when I went through that phase. Do you remember that? I was getting up and you were like, okay. And we
mhm,
knew at the time I was battling that morning cortisol spike that was taking till like 1 o'clock in the afternoon to even remotely come down. And there I am at 5 a.m., same thing. I'm on the treadmill. I'm trying to kill it. And you warned me then. So, and that's why I asked the question, because some people don't understand what that's doing.
yeah, I was simply just trying to push my body to move more. Like I said, not respecting circadian rhythm at all. Just still looking at the fact of doing weights, doing cardio, because cardio was supposed to help me lose the fat, right? But muscle is also important because muscle uptakes the glycogen. So I'm doing the strength training, but I'm also factoring in some of the cardio side. And like I said, it wasn't something that was sustainable. It wasn't. I mean, I was down there for 45 minutes to an hour. The meeting would always last usually about 30 to 40 minutes. But then, I would do an additional. So whether it was a strength training day or a cardio day, I would end up and do that for the meeting. Sometimes there were people that joined because we did have people around the world, and other times there wasn't. And so I just went on with, my whatever willy-nilly routine. I didn't have any form of structure to it, but I did it. And it really ended up to the point where it backfired. And ultimately, like I said, I quit because it wasn't sustainable. I was still trying to figure out what carnivore was going to end up and work for me. And that's when I ended up this person on the left.
That's the picture you sent me a week ago when you said, should I? And then my first response was, oh no. And then it was like, oh yeah. Yeah. People need to see, people are in these very shoes that you and I are in, where we were, where we're at now, and so forth. And this is so important to be vulnerable. And I know how this hits right now on your birthday on top of it. But you've come a long way here. I mean, so in that picture on the left, what were you eating then?
Carnivore.
High?
I was rotating between it.
Okay.
So I was carnivore, but I was also putting some fasting in there. So this would have been, I would have been predominantly high fat carnivore at this point.
Okay.
So, and the reason why I say that is because this would have been 2020. No, this was not because of lockdown. Because we weren't locked down. I was still functioning as normal. My job still ran as normal. And the reason why it happened was when I was still not sleeping. I wasn't doing any of, my circadian practices. I didn't get certified in that until 2021. But this would have been, I had another co-host in the evening that was doing a lot of fasting. And so then I would end up and start fasting. And him and I talked several times in like 2019, 2020. So this would have been 2 years, approximately 2.5 years after I had started carnivore. So let me go back to the other photo. I always tell people, try to take it in similar clothes so you can see I'm using the reference of the sports bra essentially. And him and I, would talk and in the meetings, or we had WhatsApp also, and I said, I can't do it. I cannot end up and do the high protein. I feel my anxiety, not so much the depression side, but the anxiety. I mean, my energy would zap. I couldn't do just daily function. And so that's why I say I was predominantly high fat, because my body, for the mental health side, needed the fat. It did end up and help that side. Being in, quote, ketosis, right? I could easily be in deep levels of ketosis at this point. But there were other factors beyond the nutrition that I was not focusing on. And you can see it led to insulin resistance. That leptin resistance ultimately led to me back to insulin resistant. So carnivore worked until it didn't. And that's when I started to reintroduce. I started the quantum biology and got certified in it in 2021. Ben Bickman come out at the point, also in speaking to the benefits of different chains of fats. knowing what I know about, food and light and all of that, I started to reintroduce. I started slow. I started with, we're going to end up and take that off the picture. I started slow. So I started with just doing the different fats. Opened it up to olive oil. I opened it up to olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, the non-animal fats, right? I was doing a lot of like suet and tallow and fat trimmings and all of that when I was carnivore. I opened it up to that. That went really well. Then I also supported a little girl in the social media space that was doing keto for epilepsy. Her name is Reese, and she was having to take a lot of her fats via syringe to school. So medical grade syringe, and we did a support for her and her mom, Maggie, but at that time. And so I had, the 10 milliliter syringes, and I was doing, all these fats. So I transitioned basically from high fat carnivore to a high fat keto with opening it up. But then I opened it up into things like the avocado, things like the olives. I really started to reintroduce slow with lower glycemic foods. And then the more I got, through my nutrition or my quantum stuff, quantum biology and circadian, I started to look at how food was grown. And that's when I started to do more of a seasonal. So things like the asparagus, right? I'm in Nebraska, for anyone that's watching that don't know. And March, April is pretty much our springtime. So the wild asparagus, and start to grow, and just a lot of those seasonal springtime foods, they went really well. But then I started to open it beyond that, and then at that point, I'm trying to think in my journey. I had started working also with another keto person or keto influencer, and their approach was more of the mindset of the 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight for the protein. Coming from low protein, that didn't work for me. It didn't work to do the 1 gram per pound of body weight plus adding, these other foods in. And so I still put a moderate amount of protein, but then my glucose and that's when, I don't think I loaded that photo. That's when I started to do a lot of work with the CGM. Currently looking. Started to do a lot of work with CGM. And here, this is another dandy of a photo. So this is 2021-ish, the beginning of 2021. It was still cold here. I actually remember we went to a concert. Is where we were with friends in that picture. And I know it's early 2021 because I'm still wearing my sunglasses. So
yeah,
that's the only.
Before we started, we were going through these pictures, and I said, Becky, you have sunglasses on, and it was interesting because I've never seen you in sunglasses. That is the first photo I've ever seen you wearing sunglasses, but it was before your quantum biology. So it makes sense you didn't know at that point what that was doing.
Yep. Yeah. And so, even at that point, I started to look at different ways of doing keto, essentially. And like I said, that would have been 21, 22 that I was in that keto space. And then I started working for Ben in July of 22. Still still was doing, keto, but I wasn't doing it necessarily to the 1 gram. That's when within the keto flexing program, there is some fasting. Well, when I got to that point, I wasn't able to do the fasting still. It would always end up and backfire on me. And so I did the fat fasting. And that's when I ended up and I created the fat fasting. That went great. I felt great doing fat fasting. For those that don't know, bringing the protein down, but keeping fats in there, mimicking the fasting effects and getting the benefit. At that point, my certification was done, and I was really focused more on the circadian biology, making sure I was getting sleep, blocking blue light at night. And then in March of 23 so 2 years ago, is when I founded the Beyond Nutrition, because having a space where people can connect about natural health, connecting and aligning their lives through nutrition, yes, but connecting through more of this intuitive side. And that's where many people get kind of vague, right? I was not using supplements. I was doing more of what are my body's hormones telling me. Now, there's different parts. Remember, I said I have a hysterectomy. There's different parts of our body that have the ability to produce hormones if the mitochondria are optimized. But if your mitochondria and your body system is running on overdrive and running in a stressed out, fearful state, it's not going to. And once I was able to connect with that side and provide my body with what it needed, and that's why I get so passionate about creating, this connection. My headphones are all jacked up here. Connecting with more of a circadian aligned approach, making sure that you are getting proper and adequate sleep, not just the quantity of sleep. It's not a case of being in bed for 8-9 hours, but what is that sleep looking like? Is your leptin docking? Is your melatonin being produced at the right time of the evening? Is cortisol's not bad. It's just when it's in, too much and it's in overdrive producing these stress hormones that it's a problem. But really taking this non-dogmatic approach of what it should look like. And I did add carbs back in. Ultimately, I ended up and I added carbs back in to help also with the thyroid side of things. And once I should have loaded that too. Once I started to reintroduce foods, that was one thing that never got better on carnivore was the Hashimoto's, the lab values of all the thyroid, right? I'm not just talking about TSH, but I'm talking about the reverse T3. I'm talking about the free T3, the T4, the antibodies. Because I was doing full thyroid panels to send to the doctor. And you can see from the point where I started doing more of a circadian approach and implementing all of that, the 6-month mark, how much it had changed. It still wasn't 100% at that 6 month, but it had reversed and I had gotten normal levels. And the reason why I said it wasn't reversed is I did have antibodies still. Lingering antibodies, I had definitely decreased them drastically, but I still had a few lingering antibodies. And a lot of people in thyroid spaces will end up, or autoimmune spaces will end up and tell you with those antibodies that you have some form of an autoimmune going on. So, but yeah, it was at that point where I felt good. I felt like I was the version of me that I needed to be, was in 2023. Ultimately, the end of middle of 2023 is also when I started working with Sarah. But yeah, that was the point when I'm looking at pictures. I don't think I loaded it. And that was the point where it was turning for me in regards of well, I had lost all my hair too. So you can see it in this photo where I had ultimately chopped my hair because with thyroid issues, stress issues, hair loss was a big thing. My hair was brittle. I would lose hair. I created a post the other day on Instagram because I would brush my hair and it was just coming out in clumps essentially. My husband would complain of the hair in the drain of the shower. I would constantly, hair all over everything. It was just like we lived with a shedding dog. And I still, will lose a few strands and that's normal. But ultimately I did end up and chop it all off, even though it looks chopped. It's not chopped. I left it in a ponytail for that reason. It's growing back fuller than it ever is. With being able to implement what I am currently doing. So there's a lot of the story and photos of how it worked until it didn't, and taking that step to reverse it and not feeling as though I needed supplements to end up and do it. Supplements to mask a lot of the symptoms that I was experiencing. It was, what is the root cause? What is the driving factor of this? How can I fix this? And pulling different levers. Because there are those levers to pull, but many people aren't willing to be consistent enough or track. That was one of the things that I did for the longest time. And as of recently, I've been able to give it up, but tracking. And I know we have a couple questions coming up here later. So anyone that is still bearing with me throughout all of this, post your questions if you have them. But that was one of the things that, people were talking about, was the supplement side of it, or feeling like they needed to take the poke in the carnivore space. And I just want to be able to be a voice, because it's really big right now in the push of the poke. And anyone that I'm speaking to the GLP-1 pokes for any, I have to clarify sadly, unfortunately, since 2020, I have to clarify which poke I'm talking about, but
right.
I am speaking to the GLP-1s, and that's one of the things that I have never taken. You and I speak about this a lot because I am very strongly against them.
And I am currently on a poke,
Yeah.
on a GLP-1. And you and I talked about this. We've talked about this a lot. And even though we have very similar views on it and opposing views on it, because ultimately I decided to go with what I did. And in the coming weeks, we will kind of unfold both sides of it. And we'll dive in deeper into the whole GLP-1 side of things, because it really is the latest and greatest miracle drug out there. But it goes back to, it's still medicine, right? And like I said, Becky and I are going to unfold this. We want everyone to hear both of what we have to say, because there are much that I absolutely agree with Becky, and ultimately I still did what I did, right? So there's still mitigating factors on that side. It's definitely worth a good subject to talk about, but going back to supplements, explain a little bit more why you do not like supplements, besides you don't like to swallow pills. There's more to that.
Yeah. So supplements, again, just whether it's supplements or whether it's the GLP-1, it doesn't get to the root cause. You are simply slapping a Band-Aid on what you are needing to fix. You are not being in tune with the body. You're essentially, you're really messing and creating a biochemical chaos, in my opinion. Whether that's the hunger side of it, or whether that's years of, inflammation and insulin resistance, disrupted circadian rhythm, emotional trauma patterns. What is it that is the driving factor that is inevitably causing whatever you're dealing with, right? Is it that you are taking a supplement for gut health? Well, a lot of the trauma can also affect the gut. Is it blue light, right? That can end up in skipping breakfast even.
Yeah.
So there's, the blue light at night that impacts our hunger. There's skipping breakfast in the morning. There's chronic undereating. When I ended up and I said before that I was doing low protein, my meals look a lot different then. They were also, a lot of people will also be eating hyper palatable foods. They're not necessarily looking at whole foods. So, a lot of these issues that will, for many people, create the word food noise, is essentially their supplement for, right? And I don't personally like slapping supplements on that. Can't digest food? Well, what's going on with the gut, right? Why do you have low enzymatic function? Why are you not able to incorporate other, probiotic or prebiotic type foods? You don't have, you're not able to sleep at night because your melatonin is off because you slept through sunrise, or you've been blasted with blue light all day long and you haven't wound down in the evening, and then you're extra hungry the next day because you have blood sugar issues. So then you end up and you start taking supplements such as berberine or something along those lines, right, to balance the blood sugar, which if you end up and you start to pull some of these levers, that you can't out supplement a bad lifestyle. Right. You cannot end up and take a bunch of supplements and have this bad lifestyle, whether that's light, minerals, etc., and expect to get better. You can't end up and have a perfect nutrition plan, but be packing on hundreds of dollars of supplements and make it sustainable.
Yeah, you and I've thrown out hundreds of dollars of supplements because of, and I mean, it's, yeah. I mean, I see clients, I see people just in general, that when they hear, oh, take this, they're ordering it like, okay, how do you spell that? Like, what is this again? Let me, but here's the thing. I was that way when I first started too. I didn't know any different, right? I was still playing Dr. Google for keto and how to do that. And it's like, oh, eat Quest chips and, and thinking I was doing okay. And so I get it. But I know at one point years ago, I was taking the DHEA supplement, but I'd had lab work that supported, and I wanted to do more of a natural approach than getting on meds. So that's why I took it. But I remember talking about it one time to a group of people, and they immediately wanted to buy it. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Do you even know what your labs are? Is this something that supports that? Magnesium, there's a difference between minerals and there's a difference between supplements, and people don't even know that differences as well. You and I do a lot of minerals versus supplements. It's an interesting path, but Yeah.
when we look at the mitochondrial side of things.
Yeah.
Right. That's where we got to fix the redox side of it. We got to be able to have this mitochondrial support. And that's where minerals end up and come in. So electrolytes are minerals, but minerals aren't necessarily electrolytes. And that's where many people get confused, because that we don't get minerals from our living anymore. Our soil's depleted, our water, is not natural spring water. It's not coming from the same places. So we don't get our minerals. A lot of people are also supplementing in wrong ratios, the supplements. So that's where figuring out what works for your body, for your mitochondria, in regards of supplementing those minerals. I choose to end up and do, a certain way on the electrolytes, and I also do minerals. Because I also need things like the fulvic and the humic acid and a lot of those other natural minerals that come from some of these ancient, practices, if you will, that end up and help that mitochondria. And that's why and that's what I loved about the quantum side of things, right? When you end up and you break it down, it looks at the body a whole lot different. And how the inner matrix and how the fascia and this whole side of the body ends up and work, more so than just nutrition, right? It looks at it as far as energy and creating that ATP and creating that, what is the body doing on this smaller scale? The electrons and the protons of the body, right? And what is it creating this into? How are we gaining electrons through grounding, which is an energy source, So there's a lot of that side of it where looking on that deeper scale helped support my body anyway, than just looking at it from food and supplement. What is the muscle doing? What is the stem factor of the inflammation, right? It's not, oh, I have an achy joint, I need to take, something for it, but what is driving that, and making sure that I have the exclusion zone water build up, and so all of that side of it is what ultimately come into play. It sounds very complicated, but it's really not. It's one of the most sustainable ways that I looked at, and I've now been doing, like I said, I got certified in the quantum biology 4 years ago, and it's one of the most sustainable. Now, do I continue to improve year after year? Absolutely, which is one of the other reasons why we decided to talk about this tonight. Was I have constantly seen improvement over the last 4 years.
Well, let me backtrack and ask you, what made you want to go into and learn about quantum biology?
My searching of rabbit holes. I was always someone, and I wasn't afraid to say, if I don't know the answer, I will look, I will read studies, I will dig. And the reason why I say dig is because there's a study out there that can support both sides of every argument, right? Yeah. And so really looking at, is it truly, a study? Is it truly a article that is, non-biased, if you will? Or what is their agenda behind this study? And like I said, that's where I ultimately had to go. Was the more I started to dig, the more I started to uncover, fat isn't bad. We were always told, that fat was bad and that we needed to take it out of our diet. And that's also when the big sugar movement made its mark in the big food space. And that's also when, big pharma started to get their play in a lot of processed foods.
Yes.
And for those that don't know, yes, it is all intertwined. Your big food and your big pharma are playing a drastic role in what you are purchasing and what you are consuming. And just that push of constantly wanting to dig deeper, constantly wanting to get back to basics. Um, it was like I would search down one thing and that would open up about 3 more doors. And then I would search it, those, and I was constantly learning. And I think that's the biggest thing for anyone is
Yes.
don't just take and don't take necessarily my advice either.
Right.
Solely my advice, right? End up and do your research and look at what is working, or are you just following so and so ended up and told me that this is the way I needed to eat. So and so told me that, this is what I needed to do. Is that going to work for you? Or, are you white knuckling and stressing your way through the day? Are you pushing beyond where your body feels comfortable?
Right. Perfect example is both of us when we tried to do traditional fasting. We both white knuckled it and we were pushing, and I remember being told, not by you, by an actual doctor, that I needed to fast more and longer. And it was like it didn't make sense because the proof was in the numbers, where my blood sugar was getting worse, I was gaining weight, it was a high stress situation for my body. My body was not sound enough to be able to fast. And you said you don't fast traditionally to this day. You probably could. You're a lot further along than what you were a couple years ago. In fact, what did you eat tonight, Becky?
Yeah, so I am a lot further than what I have ever been. And that's where, for people that want to speak about food freedom and really having metabolic flexibility, because there are days where I am very consistent, right? I end up and I meal plan and I end up and I do all of that. There's days where that satiety is there and it's like, I don't eat to a certain macro anymore. And I say anymore because I was very strict with tracking macros. And so I'll skip dinner and I feel good the next day. I sleep good. But I also know when, if I don't sleep good, then I need to add more energy. Energy molecules are either your fats or your carbs. So, I need to end up and add that. But I'm at a point now where, for instance, tonight I was able to eat a steak and a baked potato.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also able to enjoy a piece of birthday cake with my family. My family surprised me Saturday when my daughter come down and had bought me a birthday cake, and I didn't load that picture. Should have finished it off tonight with that. But my family bought a birthday cake and I was able to eat a piece of cake. I don't feel, my stomach's not in knots. I don't feel a headache and I don't feel like I'm going to end up and go eat the whole rest of the cake. There may have been a time in the past where that would have definitely been the case, but no, I have my piece of cake for my birthday and I'm done.
That's what metabolic freedom is about. Not that you do that every week, not that you do it every month, but you got to enjoy your birthday cake. And we talked about where do you want to be? Where do you want to see yourself even in another year or two, Becky?
I will still be doing the same thing because that's what I am passionate about. And by the same thing, I mean the foundational practices, right? I will still end up and be doing my light routine, my morning light, waking up, doing my morning breakfast. So morning sunlight, within that 30 minutes of waking, it helps to regulate the cortisol and the melatonin. So it stores that melatonin. It does also help with improving that mitochondrial function. So, and if for anyone that is looking at lowering, systemic inflammation, that's one of the easiest ways is to go out for morning sunrise and ground. And you can just sit in a chair in your lawn, or I sit on my deck steps. It's kind of my morning time of silence, if you will. I'll still be doing my stress management. I mean, we have breath work in the community, but whether it's gratitude or some form of vagus nerve stimulation, because as someone that had IBS, that's one of the things that it helps to improve the digestion. It also helps to reduce that gut inflammation. So I'll still be doing that in a year. My walks, my movement, my exercise, that varies. I still, if I have to say, that's one thing that, I still juggle with, is I'm getting some form of active carry 40-pound children, but I get some
with
form
the
of
weighted vest. With the weighted vest now. Come on.
I do. I have my 25-pound weighted vest. So I do that. When I look at the day, I'll still circadian light routine, blocking that blue light at night, wearing my blue blockers, or controlling my lighting environment. That will all still end up and be a factor. I don't foresee that changing in the next year. If nothing else, structuring a little bit better, even, because I'm not perfect. There are things that can end up and be improved in that. So,
well, you have children at home still, so the sleep that will change, Becky, just so you know, as an empty nester person, that changes. Like, that's a whole nother level of, ooh, I can sleep now.
Lord help me, I hope so.
That's those darn teenagers. But yeah, no, it's a whole different. Now, like, it was funny last night. So my husband wears a CPAP machine, and we went from a king size bed to a queen size bed in our camper. And so every movement and every sound and anyway, he was struggling with his CPAP machine last night, which now I didn't get as good of rest as what I should have. But it's funny that most nights now I sleep very good. So that's going to come when the teens get to, go do their college-ish and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I want to thank you, because this was actually my idea from the picture that you showed me last week. And it's like, no, this has got to be a very honest and real conversation, because people look at you as Coach Becky, right? You have all the answers in a lot of their minds. They didn't see and they didn't know what you went through to get to where you are today, right? And it is so important, because if you helped one person throughout this conversation, it was so worth it. And I know this was hard. I know those pictures were hard. Um, I have those pictures. Those pictures, you have seen one or two of them. I don't know if they'll ever see the light of day, but I still take them, right? Because I still need to see the process. You're still taking them. You're still seeing the process, because you still see yourself as one of those other pictures, not how you truly look now. So it's all a growing, learning, healing process. Thank you so very much for really not only putting yourself out there and being very vulnerable, but doing it on your birthday.
Well, and that's one of the biggest things that I want people to take away from this is there are times that it is going to end up and be a struggle. There are times where you're not going to have the answers. There's times where I may see this person on the left, but there's also times where we need to normalize what healthy looks like.
Yeah.
And that is where, am I where I think I would like to be? No. Am I where my heart knows that I'm healthy? This is where I pose the question to a lot of people, even in the BNC community, what does health look like? And we actually have a couple questions that I'll answer before we end. I know we're over time, but in your heart, what does healthy look like? Right? I know my insulin resistance is gone. I know that I am a healthy BMI in this picture. But there's people that end up and see influencers. There's people that end up and see, models. There's people that end up and see people on, actors or actresses on TV. And we end up and we get this ideology of where the body needs to be because they must be healthy. Where instead, if I can help anyone, it's a case of what is healthy. And that for me is the fact of I no longer have a health condition on my medical record. I no longer have medication that I have to take. I have good energy. I have a good mental place where if we end up and we get comments, not to say that there's not comments out there that I'm like, they drive me bonkers, but I'm also not going to let it drag me down, right? I am in a place where I can let that roll, and that's where people ultimately, they need to look at health. It's not rail thin. It's not, single digit body fat percentage as a female, because you're going to start having hormone issues. You're going to start having all sorts of other issues. We need to normalize what a healthy body fat percentage looks like. We need to normalize what a healthy body looks like and not strive for, like I said, rail thin. So hopefully, if anything out of the story helps anyone, definitely put it in the comments, put it in, after when we post this live. But like I said, there are a couple questions. So if you have questions before I jump to the BNC meeting, one of them was how to transition to lower protein and not under eat. I do feel like there is a adequate amount of protein. You had heard me say that I was doing low protein as a carnivore. I don't feel like that ended up and worked. Ultimately, it wasn't sustainable. And that's why I say it doesn't work. It worked for blood sugar stability, but it wasn't something that was sustainable. So getting more of an adequate amount of protein right now, I feel as though that depends on an activity level. So there's not necessarily, again, that blanket statement that you can put for someone, because how active is a person? How, where are they? And so in a lower protein aspect, if you're only, unless you're, I called her out earlier today, but unless you're, short like our little Coach Sly, love you dearly, girlfriend, but you may be able to get away. I think she's maybe like 4'11.5" or something. Relatively short, but maybe, I don't know, 5'2". I don't know what she is, but she's short. Anyway, you may be able to get away with a little bit lower on the protein side, but the person that asked that question, I know you're not that. So I don't know that you need to go that low, but and then the second part of that question was how to eat enough fat and not feel hungry. Fat may not be your satiety energy molecule. So when I spoke about the energy and the way that we get it from food, fat may not end up and be that. And for me, I can use both. So I can either have a higher carb meal or a carb meal and feel satiated off of it, or I can have a high fat meal, things like sausage or bacon and avocado or, fat trimmings or something along those lines, and I can feel satiated, but that may not be yours. So I'll throw out my sweet friend Sarah. And she is one of those. Fat is not a satiety. She can end up and overeat on the fat side of it and never feel full. So you may be the type of person that fat is not ever going to end up and hit that for you. And then, yeah, as for your quote optimal protein, that's the way that you have the macro or the calculation is not the way I would end up and recommend it. I would start with about 1.5 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight is where I would end up and start with protein. Not necessarily what calculation you sent me. So, yeah. Let me look at Instagram. I don't know that I had any on Instagram, but I wanted to throw those in there and get those answered for her. So hopefully that helps. And like I said, hopefully my story of it working until it didn't and figuring out what worked for me helps someone.
Yes, it's definitely a journey. One that you know what, you can't give up after a month or two and go, well, that didn't work. Let me try, it's a constant change. It's a constant figuring out what your body needs, what works for your body. And that is why we call this healing the whole body, because it is a process. So Becky, thank you so much. I just, if I was in person with you, I would give you a big hug. You did so good. And I'm so proud of you. Thank you and happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Hoping to be more open, be even that further open book. We're going to end up and break the bind, if you will, and open it a little bit further, because I think that story needs to be put out there more in regards of, like I said, on social media. And we see a lot of the louder voices out there, and I don't feel like they are promoting health or what health should look like in a female perspective. So
Absolutely. Well, so we have a guest coming up. I'm very excited about that. That's next week, right? And so we'll be starting to advertise on who we got. I'm excited. We both met this person last year at Hack Your Health. And we'll probably see this person again this year at Hack Your Health. I think he's definitely going to be there again. So we're excited about that. And if there is someone you would like us to talk to, drop us a comment. We would love to hear this. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps the algorithms and it gets us out there more. We are not sponsored by anyone. We're just, again, two women that are trying to help people and ourselves heal the whole body. So again, thank you so much for watching tonight, and look for our special guest next week, and have a good rest of your week, everyone. Thanks.